He does, and so maybe sticking with an example where I fall back on an appeal to my passions would help illuminate this kind of situation. So let's say that my choice is to marry, and I might think that in a certain sense I'm compelled by the world. It's the power of my love for this person that has made me decide to marry, and that power, as it were, pushes me from within, and it's as though I had no choice. Sartre's point is, well, look, you did have a choice in the sense that it was up to you whether to live your life as one of the people who lets the passion of love dictate whether marriage is the appropriate course. Many people, after all, for many years, thought of marriage as something that you did as a contract based on what your family needed, not at all based on that passion of love. So it was a choice of yours to attribute force to that passion. Now, we go into bad faith when we insist, in spite of this fact about us that Sartre has pointed out, normally we flee from that fact. We insist that we didn't have a choice in some important sense, precisely by attributing so much power, so much weight, so much force to the passion of love that we have chosen for ourselves. And I think what's really going on there is that we want for our choice to seem to us not to be arbitrary, to be something pushed on us by the world. And so it's anxiety producing to think of it as something that has force only insofar as we ourselves endorsed it or put it out there.
Well, you introduced the term bad faith, and that's the crucial concept in his,
That's right.
I don't know if you would call it his psychology, probably even more his ontology of human subjectivity. And perhaps we should take a few minutes to unpack exactly what he meant by this term of mauvaise foi, of bad faith. Sometimes it's translated in English as self-deception, but of course self-deception is not exactly what the French mauvaise foi, it means literally bad faith. How do you understand the concept of bad faith and then the mechanism by which it operates in us?
It is true that self-deception is kind of a core example of bad faith, and Sartre presents it that way, although bad faith itself is a much more fundamental structure of which self-deception is sort of a more obvious manifestation or something like that. But let's focus on self-deception as the obvious manifestation, and then we can dig deeper. Sartre thought of the problem of self-deception as a really hard problem, because what's going on in self-deception is a kind of paradoxical structure of our consciousness. After all, we couldn't be deceiving ourselves if we didn't deep down know the truth about what's really going on in our life. If I didn't deep down know that it's up to me to count love as the most important thing, then it wouldn't be self-deception for me to pretend that love is forcing itself on me. Okay, but if I deep down know that, how can I be deceived? Many philosophers have been tempted in explaining this phenomenon to just postulate some kind of fixed, thoroughgoing division within the self. In particular, people want to make a division between an unconscious part of me and a conscious part of me, and they think that somehow that'll help, the duality will somehow help us explain self-deception, because then part of me can know the truth and the other part of me can be deceived. Sartre, I think, quite plausibly points out that this really doesn't solve the problem, it just pushes it around and creates the pretense of a solution. Because after all, when the unconscious part of me is supposed to know the truth, it's supposed to know something. It's supposed to be something like a little quasi-consciousness in me that has attitudes and expresses its needs symbolically because it realizes that its needs are going to be repressed by the conscious part of the self. But if it's already conscious of its needs as to be repressed, then it has to be in something like bad faith in order for the whole system to work. And so the real problem of bad faith, Sartre thinks, is to understand how bad faith could possibly work in the full light of consciousness, how we could simultaneously be the deceiver and the deceived.
In fact, some of the most compelling pages of Being and Nothingness, his major philosophical opus of his existentialist period anyway, for me are the pages in which he engages in Freud's theory of the unconscious and posits this problem between a division between the conscious and the unconscious, and he focuses on the very peculiar role that the censor has in Freud's theory of psychoanalysis, where the censor, as Sartre puts it, is almost like a border patrol which will admit certain contents of the unconscious to enter consciousness if it has a proper passport, if it has the proper visas, and so on and so forth, and that the censor is the agency that knows exactly what the unconscious wants and the conscious, and therefore he says that it's in precisely the role of the censor that free choice and self-determination are actually taking place, that I am responsible for what I allow from the depths of my unconscious to enter my consciousness and what I don't allow. No?
That's right. And I love that metaphor of the border control too. So it's like the censor will allow the unconscious id to express itself, but only when it falsely presents itself with false documentation, as though it's an ordinary citizen, when in fact it's, the emissary of the id. But the real crux of the critique of Freud here is that the censor has to know what's in the id and what needs to be repressed, and know that it should be repressed. And as Sartre puts it, the censor knows that content of the id in order not to know it, in order to make sure that it stays out of consciousness. But that means that the censor itself is already in bad faith. And so bad faith, self-deceiving bad faith, hasn't been explained by this theory. It's been presupposed by this theory.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm never cease to be astonished at the degree to which bad faith is a almost ineluctable condition. And it's always tempting to attribute it to others and think that I myself am the one who's not self-deceived, or I'm in good faith. But of course, that's even scarier, where you start contemplating the degree to which you may be as much of a victim of bad faith as you think others are, because the mind has such clever resources at its disposal when it comes to making ourselves believe what we know is not true. And this is what is so compelling about Sartre's existentialism, is that he is forever suspicious of this mechanism by which we willfully cause ourselves to believe something that we know is not true, or vice versa. No?
That's right. And part of what's gripping and compelling about the theory is that he shows how deeply rooted in the fundamental ontology of our selfhood this capacity to be in bad faith really is. So he traces it to two fundamental aspects of being a person. On the one hand, there's a part of being a person which is to have things that are factually true about you, ways that you just are. I have a certain kind of body, I was born in a certain place, I'm a certain age, and so forth. I have a certain kind of face once I get to be old enough. These are parts of what Sartre called our facticity. But at the same time, there's a basic fact about consciousness, that consciousness always has the capacity to, as it were, stand back from these facts and take up an attitude toward them, showing thereby that consciousness isn't just these facts, it's something more than they are. It can take up the attitude, for example, of condemning them, or, wishing to be otherwise, or deciding to make yourself be otherwise. And what makes bad faith possible is the oscillation between these two basic structural features of being a consciousness at all. So he gives the example of being on a date, which I think is a great example of how omnipresent this possibility of bad faith is. So, let's face it, when you're out on a date with another person, the point of being there is to come to a decision about whether to have sex with this person.
Now, you proposed that in the philosophical reading group one day, and you got a lot of grief for that, because there are a lot of people who will not agree that the only point of being out on a date is whether it's going to end up in sex or not. So,
what makes it a date?
Well,